say a word or two and then toss things to you.
Excellent. You're all set.
Okay. So hello for all those who I have not yet said hello to, and welcome to History Matters, and so does coffee. My coffee is lurking over here. Today we're going to be talking about women and resistance, or women and protest, or women activists. Those different descriptions might all fit. It's a topic that I came up with before recent events, and the timing is just coincidental that we are where we are while we're talking about this. But I'm going to be talking, as I mentioned in the little teaser, about a number of women who touched me in some particular way, and then we'll step back a little bit and see what that means. But before we launch in, I shall now turn things over to my partner in crime, Matt, who will explain the ground rules for asking questions and et cetera, et cetera.
Excellent. Thank you, Joanne. And as always, this is brought to you by the National Council for History Education. And if you enjoy our work, please join us as a member, or just peruse our website, www.nche.net. And we have lots of offerings for teachers, for historians, for anybody interested in history. So please join us. Today is, if this is your first time, please try to put any comments or anything in the chat. We always love to hear where you're from, so that's always great. And we're seeing a great weather report from around the world today, so feel free to put that in as well. If you have questions as we go along, please put them in the Q&A, and we'll try to answer as many as possible after Joanne is done speaking. And with that, I'm going to put the highlight back on Joanne and hide myself, and we'll get going for today.
Okay. And there we go. Okay, perfect. Okay, so hello to everybody. So I'm going to be talking about actually 3 women today. Newspapers are on my feed. That tells you more about my apartment than you need to know. So I'm going to be talking about 3 women today. I'm going to be talking about them chronologically. They're not necessarily the 3 most inspiring historical figures that are women. There are 3 that when I knew I was going to talk about this topic, I thought of 3 that either recently have really touched me in some way, or just people who come back to me again and again as inspirational for their spirit and their work and their willingness to fight in an atmosphere that does not welcome that fight for the things that they believe in. I will say at the outset that one of the things that helps these women make that kind of transition from, for many of them, private life to some form of public life, or having a public presence, or being an activist, is the fact that even from a really early point, and the first person I'm going to be talking about was born in the 18th century, women were always assumed to have some kind of moral authority, right? That you know, men had public virtue, women had some kind of moral authority, and the home was bound up in it. And some of these women took advantage of that authority to assert themselves into having a public voice and to talking about, in a sense, the moral authority or the morality of society. So they transitioned, they sort of parlayed their way into having a different kind of voice from what some other women of the period had. And one of the things that they were capable of doing, and I'd say this would be true for any person of color and women as well, because of their status and because of their compromised status, they were particularly good at highlighting contradictions and gaps and inequalities. They were, you know, well qualified to see them and knew what they were speaking of and were willing to speak about it. Now I want to start with the first in our timeline here, and that's Mercy Otis Warren, who, and I think I even got birth and death years here. I think I've got them for all 3. She was born in 1728. She died in 1814. Oh, and I should say, while I launch in here, the things that I posted today, normally I post a primary document and I sort of link my comments to that document. This week I've done something a little different since I'm more people-centric, but I have posted primary documents. So in the case of Mercy Otis Warren, you'll see if you go and check out what's been attached to the NCHE Conversations website, I've included a collection of her letters that I found, to my very pleasant surprise last night, is actually online. I also included some letters between her and John Adams, which I will explain momentarily, and then you will see why they are of interest and might be of interest to you. So at any rate, 1728 to 1814, what's interesting about Mercy Otis Warren is that at this very early point, really during the American Revolution, she becomes this very outspoken political commentator. She does it in different ways. She does it in poetry. She writes plays that are pretty pointed in their satire, but she also writes public treatises. She writes pamphlets. She wrote a 3-volume history of the American Revolution, which I'm going to come back to. But she really was not shy, in a sense, about putting her voice in the public. She was very conscious of where she thought, or what she thought her voice should be. So she, even in speaking about the American Revolution, her history, she describes herself as giving moral observations. So she's clinging to that as her source of authority. But even so, she's someone who is right out there and, in a sense, radical in her political beliefs at this really early point. And I want to offer you a couple examples. And I will say, too, mentioning that American Revolution 3-volume history that she wrote, in some ways, she is one of the, if not the first woman historian in the United States. So for that alone, I salute Mercy Otis Warren, but I salute her for all of these other reasons as well. To give you an example of her voice, during the Revolution, so in this case, we're talking about 1775, her husband James and she were very close friends with John and Abigail Adams, and they corresponded a lot. And in this case, there's a letter that her husband James is writing to John Adams, who is in the Continental Congress. And apparently, according to James Warren, Mercy Otis Warren interrupted his writing of the letter. And I'm going to read what he said here. She, meaning Mercy Otis Warren, sits at the table with me and will have a paragraph of her own. So she's inserting herself into the letter. She says, you, meaning the Continental Congress, should no longer piddle at the threshold. It is time to leap into the theater, to unlock the bars and open every gate that impedes the rise and growth of the American Republic, and then let the giddy potentate send forth his puerile proclamations to France, to Spain, and all the commercial world who may be united in building up an empire which he can't prevent. And then she writes a little poem. She says, at leisure then may George his reign review, and bid to empire and to crown adieu, for lordly mandates and despotic kings are obsolete like other quondam things. So she just inserted herself into that letter and basically says to John Adams, come on, you know, this is 1775. Everyone has not jumped on the independence bandwagon. Mercy Otis Warren is there, has this friend who is of past political authority, and she's there voicing exactly what she thinks should happen. And she doesn't stop. So she ends up during the constitutional debate. She actually doesn't like the Constitution. She is an anti-federalist. Her reason for not liking the Constitution is that she thinks it's too powerful and too centralized and too likely to deprive Americans of rights. So essentially the Bill of Rights, she kind of wins this fight. She didn't single-handedly get a Bill of Rights added to the Constitution, but that helped address some of her fears, not all of them. But she not only opposed the Constitution, but she wrote as to why she opposed the Constitution, why she thought it was dangerous when the ratification debate was going on. She wrote a number of newspaper essays, written not under her own name, which is significant, and they were reprinted as counter essays or counter arguments to some of the Federalist essays. Mercy Otis Warren, right? Piping up. People didn't know it was Mercy Otis Warren, but still, she's out there offering her view about the Constitution and what's wrong with it. And ultimately, she publishes observations on the new Constitution in 1788 to, again, express her fears and qualms about the Constitution and why she's nervous about it and what she thinks people should watch out for. Now, she then goes on later in her life to write, as I mentioned, this 3-volume history of the American Revolution, titled History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution. And she says, as I mentioned at the outset, she's making moral observations, which they kind of are and kind of aren't, on the revolution and its after effect. So she says that the revolution was about small r Republican values. She says it was about the natural equality of man, their right of adopting their own modes of government, the dignity of the people. But then she says, after the revolution, things started to regress. And she describes part of that regression as belonging to John Adams. She says John Adams betrayed some of the basic values of this new republic. She says, after living near the splendor of courts and courtiers, I left a T off, Adams had relinquished the Republican system and forgotten the principles of the American Revolution, which he had advocated for near 20 years. And she even says he had a partiality for monarchy. And she comes out guns blazing as to, and this is 1805, so it's later in time from that earlier conversation, but she really comes out with a very strong statement about what she thinks is going wrong post-Constitution as the new republic really launches. And although her family for a very long time was friendly with the Adams family, and she particularly was encouraged in her writing by John Adams, she now feels compelled to come forward with that kind of message. Now, quite obviously, this did not make John Adams happy. It made him very unhappy. What I've posted as among the primary documents that you'll find on the NCHE website this week is a series of letters from her to John Adams, responding to his letters. I didn't, and there's a lot of them, so I didn't go back and find the Adams letters to her, which you can find if you go to Founders Online from the National Archives. They have, you know, a lot of the Adams family papers there. These were there. You'll see the link with the documents in which he's going point by point by point, arguing with her about how she gets everything wrong. And she's standing up for herself and saying exactly why she thinks what she thinks. So it's a really interesting conversation between a man and a woman, former friends, now maybe not so much, arguing about politics, about the revolution, about history. So it really, you can hear her voice. So that's why I posted that there. So Mercy Otis Warren I put forward just because I love the fact that in a climate that really wasn't friendly to this kind of assertion, she put herself out there and really voiced her thoughts in private letters too, but in public in a really striking kind of a way. Okay, I have to move on because I'm gonna talk your ears off. Woman number two, the person who I wanna remark as my second person today. In the teaser, I said there were two women you've probably heard of. I assume many people have heard of Mercy Otis Warren. I'm guessing a lot of people have not heard of Jane Swisshelm. She's not someone that I was deeply familiar with before I wrote my most recent book. She was born in 1815. She died in 1884. She was a journalist. She was an activist. She was a reformer. She was an abolitionist. She fought for women's rights. She owned and created many newspapers and really was a part of the emerging women's rights movement at the time. She came forward and created a newspaper because she had been working for one and writing for it, and it stopped publication. So she basically just said, okay, then I'm going to create my own. And I have to read you how she described the response to her coming forward to create a newspaper. And she was 33 years old. It was basically one sheet, right? Her newspaper is like, here are things, you know, that I have to say in a small amount of space, but here, it's a newspaper and I'm going to send it out to the world and assert my views. So she says that when she first put that out, newspaper editors responded, quote, like the world was falling. A woman had started a political paper? A woman? She says newspapermen were grabbing at their pants to save them from that woman. So, you know, she has a sense of humor about what's going on, but again, she has the oomph to step forward and do this and do it repeatedly. She does this with more than one newspaper, that she steps forward and either edits or controls or creates a number of different newspapers so she can have her political say. Now, the way that I came across her was she becomes one of the earliest woman reporters in Washington, D.C., a sort of ongoing correspondent. And it's interesting. So, we talk about congressional correspondence or, a foreign correspondent. That word is linked to the history of that position. When people in the mid-19th century went to Washington and reported, they would send letters back to their editor, literally written in the form of a letter about what they saw, what they heard. They were kind of personal. There wasn't yet the right voice for people to use to make that kind of report. So they went with a personal, it allowed them to have a little more leeway with what they were saying. So people were letter writers, were corresponding from Washington, now we call them correspondents. But she was one of the first woman correspondents in Washington. She got there, and this is true in the case, in Mercy Otis Warren's case, she was educated partly because her father, her brother, her husband all really encouraged her. She sat in on her brother's tutoring so that she could gain an education that way. In this case, Horace Greeley, who is the editor of the powerhouse New York Tribune, gave her a job as a freelance reporter. And so she became the first woman writing letters from Washington. Now, the thing that caught my interest is how she described what she was doing while she was in Washington. She says, and this is from her autobiography / memoir. That's what I posted online in her case, is a link to her memoir titled, I think it's Half a Century. And this comes from that. She says she got to Washington and, quote, "No woman had ever had a place in the Congressional Reporters Gallery. This door I wanted to open to them." So she insists her way in to getting a seat in the Reporters Gallery as a woman. As luck would have it, she ends up being there the day in 1850 when Henry Foote, a Southern congressman, pulled a gun on Thomas Hart Benton. This is in the Senate. There was a big, someone at the time called it a stampede. It was a big deal. There were people screaming and running from the galleries. It was a moment. That was her first day as a congressional reporter, and she wrote about it. And then there were mixed responses to her report, which I think I included in my book. Some people said, oh, it was really good because it had the breathless excitement that a woman would have. Thanks. Others just didn't like it at all and wondered what the heck she was doing there and why she was reporting. But again, she's a person who not only came forward with a voice, but she pushed her way in to having that kind of voice and putting herself in a place where she would be able to not just speak publicly, but be heard. So you can get a little bit more of a sense of her from the link that I posted at the NCHE website. And then the last woman I want to talk about is Ida B. Wells, who's kind of a personal heroine of mine. She was born in 1862. She died in 1931. She was a journalist. She was an educator. She was an activist. She was a major anti-lynching advocate. She was an early civil rights advocate. She was one of the founders of the NAACP. She was born into slavery in Tennessee, which makes everything that I'm going to tell you here that much more remarkable. Her father was a supporter of education. He was a trustee at Rust College, so clearly that was something that her family valued. At the age of 24, she wrote, quote, "I will not begin at this late date by doing what my soul abhors, sugaring men," which is a great verb, "weak, deceitful creatures with flattery to retain them as escorts or to gratify a revenge." That's a powerful statement, and that's a really powerful statement for the 19th century. Now she, I don't want to say it immediately makes her known, but one of the ways in which she becomes known, I suppose you could say, is a result of something that happens to her in 1884 on a train. Her the main thing that lifted her to fame has to do with her writing about lynching. I'm going to come back to that. But in 1884, she was on a ladies' car in a train. She was told, a Black woman in a car with white women, that she needed to leave the car and go to the smoking car which was behind this one and was packed full of people. And she refused to leave. She was forcibly removed by 3 men who dragged her off the train. And as a response to that, she sued the railroad partly to just show what had just happened, but hopefully I think she really wanted to make a point and maybe institute some kind of a change. She actually initially won that case. It was later reversed. So the fact that she won is kind of amazing. The fact that it was reversed is not surprising. She wrote after that, "I felt so disappointed because I had hoped such great things from my suit for my people. Oh God, is there no justice in this land for us?" Now, this brings us to her writing about lynching. She was pulled into that because partly a friend of hers was lynched. This is in Memphis, Tennessee. His name was Thomas Moss. He had a grocery store not very far away from a white grocery store. He had one that was largely had Black customers. The person who had the white grocery store was not thrilled that this was happening. Apparently there was a white boy and a Black boy playing marbles in front of Moss's store. They got into a fight. It appeared that the Black child, whose name was Armour Harris, was going to win, at which point the father of the white boy came in and began to beat Armour Harris. At that point, people ran out from Moss's grocery to intervene and stop that from happening. And people, white men, did not like that from happening. So there came a series of encounters, groups of white people showing up to that grocery, clearly with no good intention, and in one case showing up in a mass, and the people in the grocery actually had guns and were willing to defend themselves in response. Ultimately, they were arrested and they were put in jail, and 75 men wearing Black masks pulled Moss and his colleagues from jail and basically lynched them, shot them dead, pulled them out of town and killed them. Now, this really, it's not that Ida B. Wells didn't know of this phenomenon, of this crime and of its impact, but this drove her to take this on as a personal issue. And she wrote a pamphlet, I suppose, or a book titled Southern Horrors, Lynch Law in All Its Phases. That's the link I've provided on the NCHE website today. She says that she wants to, and I think I'm gonna, well, I will come back and read part of what she's saying. She basically says she wants to show the total falseness of this idea that the Black men who are lynched were all criminals. She says that's nonsense. She says that a lot of lynching is, as she calls it, a barbaric practice of whites in the South that are basically, it's used by white people to intimidate and oppress and silence Black people who might show competition, economic competition, political resistance. So it's a tool of suppression. It's not a criminal solution of any kind. She wants to expose that. She makes that argument, not surprisingly. At one point, her newspaper office and her presses are destroyed. The same thing happens once to Jane Helm when she makes an argument about women's rights, and her newspaper office, actually I think about abolitionism as well, is destroyed, and the press is thrown in a river. But she really steps forward and not only makes that kind of aggressive claim, but says, quote, that she wanted to attack, quote, that old threadbare lie that Negro men rape white women. If Southern men are not careful, a conclusion might be reached which will be very damaging to the moral reputation of their women. Wow, okay? She publicly stated that. Talk about bravery and conviction. She was amazing. She ends up touring around the country and then also in England, lecturing about this issue, writing about this issue. At one point she says, I honestly believe that I am the only woman in the United States who ever traveled throughout the country with a nursing baby to make political speeches. So ahead of her time and a little bit maybe not quite a sense of humor, but very much an awareness of what she needs to do to get her message out there. She says, they threatened my life for hinting at the truth. I felt that I owed it to myself and my race to tell the whole truth. So she was amazing, very much, I've linked to Southern Horrors, but she's very much, all of these women, very much worth getting to know them because of their spirit and their bravery and their willingness to fight for rights that they believe in, even against sometimes staunch and even life-threatening resistance. That's why I wanted to talk about these three women initially, and now I'm talking about them this week. Now, given the events of this week, normally at the end of my comments, I pivot and talk a little bit about the present. So I'm going to make a couple of comments here. Initially, I was going to talk a bit about what men in early America thought about women who tried to have power, because they thought about it a lot. And it's an interesting moment for them to think about it because they are in the middle of this revolution and post-revolutionary period where everyone's pontificating about rights. And this is something that they're thinking about and that they're worried about and that they're resisting against. So one of the things I wanted to highlight now, and this is true of the present, but it's true, I think, of the recent past overall. Some of what we're looking at is women, African Americans, people of color, gaining in strength and a backlash of extreme response to that. So in other words, it's easy to look at what's happening now and just see the extreme response, the extreme, I don't know what to call it, aggression. But it's worth remembering that that is caused because people feel threatened at losing power. That's what we're watching right now. So I don't necessarily want to have, a smiley, optimistic message, but I do think it's important to note that the ferocity of the attack shows how threatened the people who are attacking feel. So, I think I heard yesterday, actually, in my news watching, I'm sure we're all doing that so much these days, people were talking about how, yes, you can compare the current moment to the 1960s, to the 1968, which is in some ways true, except that today what's going on is a much more diverse fight, right? That the protesters who are protesting now, it's a more diverse crowd, and that's a different thing entirely, and it makes the fight have a different dynamic. And, as I said at the very beginning of these conversations, we don't know what will happen next. We don't. And you can't just look to the past and equate the past and the present. But you can look at the past to understand the dynamics of how things have worked. And in the case of this morning, the dynamics of women and power and resistance, and bear that in mind as you're watching whatever is going on today. So I guess I partly want to close before I open things up for questions by saying, think about the women that I just talked about. Think about the fact that there are women, white women, Black women, people of color, particularly Black women, have been stepping forward amazingly in the public eye, just watching protests. Powerful, powerful voices, but watch for the people who are stepping forward and speaking up. Look for them, right? Because they're not all going to have big names. Probably most of them don't. There'll be people who, if you're not thinking, might be easy to overlook, but shouldn't be overlooked. So look for them, find out who they are, and if you agree with them, support them. Okay, I'm going to stop there. I'm going to take myself, I do this every week. I forget the mug. Okay, so this week I was stretching pretty far for my mug equivalents. And the only thing I could think of was my most female-ish mug. It's all I had. And I know it's like the ultimate cliche. It's like a mug that's pink with flowers. I couldn't figure out any way to link in the rest of my mugs. So this is where I landed for today. I was thinking about us, but I'll have to work on getting a better mug for this purpose. Okay, now I'm going to stop and turn things over to Matt, and we can start talking about things and answering questions. So I will temporarily shut up and have some coffee.
Oh, thank you. This is great. Folks, put in your questions. We only have one question so far, and this is about Mercy Otis Warren. This came early in the conversation, so I think it's about Mercy Otis Warren, which is, what was her pen name for the letters where she was writing in conversation with the Federalist Papers? Do you happen to know?
I know it's Columbian something, but let me find it. Columbian Patriot.
Ah, excellent.
Columbian Patriot.
That sounds like it should be my Twitter handle. What a great name.
It has oomph.
It really does. It really does. Okay, seriously, people. Okay, there better be questions or you're going to meet my questions, which...
Well, if you're not asking questions, I can talk about something that I didn't stop to have time to say. And while I'm doing that, then you guys can plant more questions.
All right.
The thing that I didn't have time to talk about, and it's one of the things that came to mind when I began thinking about this topic, has to do with one of the things that gave women power in roughly this period, particularly early, and thus one of the things that made men nervous. And that is precisely because women were not full-fledged members of the political world in the way that men were, particularly in the early period, the Mercy Otis Warren period. Particularly because they weren't, men feared that they would be better capable of slipping between the spaces and the lines and the cracks of any kind of political system and gain influence that way. Thomas Jefferson, speaking about France, says something, and I didn't have time to find the letter, but at one point he writes a letter in which he says that he saw that in France. It might be to, I'm going to forget her name, Pennsylvania woman. I'll remember her name after. At any rate, he writes a letter saying he saw these French women and they were inserting themselves where they didn't belong. And part of the reason they could is, you know, through social events, through, there are all kinds of ways that were not like I am stepping forward to talk about legislation, but less, I don't want to say less aggressive because it required a great assertion, but less obvious maybe. And that gave them a kind of power. So that was one kind of power that women had in this period. It was something that made men nervous. Years ago, when I was researching for my first book, so actually researching for my dissertation, I remember finding a genre of newspaper essays from the very beginning of the government. So 1789, 1790, and they were like little satirical essays. And in one way or another, they were making fun of women for knowing too much about politics. Right, which is a direct result of the revolution. Women were very engaged with the revolution. They emerged from that with a sense of their political power, their political ideas. They were very much present in a way that perhaps they hadn't been thinking before that point, and that made men nervous. So I remember seeing an essay making fun of a woman who was so well versed in the politics of the moment that she knew the identity of all the pseudonyms, the political writers in the newspaper. I remember an essay pretending as though there was a woman applying to be the doorkeeper of Congress. And obviously that was symbolic and there was a lot of venting, you know, a woman, like a doorkeeper for Congress, like women should not be doorkeepers of politics. So at any rate, it's interesting to note, and there are books about this time period that talk about this phenomenon, that the very thing that gave women some access to power was the very thing that ultimately frightened many men because they recognized that.
And this is great. We're starting to get some questions coming in, mostly I'm guessing because people don't want to hear my questions, obviously, is what I think is going on. But no, seriously, we have great questions coming in. Did Mercy Otis Warren's husband continue to support her as she became more vocal in the 1800s? This is from Lindsay.
I'm not aware of any resistance on his part. I mean, I did not go back and reread. There's a nice biography of Mercy Otis Warren by Rosemary Zagari, Z-A-G-A-R-R-I. It's brief and nice and concise and sort of captures her importance there. And also, as long as I'm talking about Rosemary Zagari, she wrote a book titled Revolutionary Backlash about the fate of women and women's rights in the time following the revolution, which also touches on a lot of these themes. So those are both great books on this topic.
Excellent. And why, Francesca wanted to know, why was Otis Warren writing, I think it's about Otis Warren, correct me if I'm wrong. Why a newspaper and not a political pamphlet?
Well,
she did both. Okay. Well, that was an easy one to answer.
I should also say too, pamphlets were expensive to produce.
Okay.
You know, I mean, they're lengthier. They're they're lengthier. They cost more. They cost more to buy. They cost more to produce. I'm holding a pamphlet. I just wanted to. Okay, so this is a copy of the Reynolds pamphlet, like the original pamphlet. And you know, it's a lengthy pamphlet, but it's still, it would not have been in a hardcover when it came out. So it gives you a sense that that's a kind of substantial piece of writing, and it has probably a less broad audience than something that would get put in a newspaper.
This is Jane Swishalm. This is from Grace, and so she was wondering, how was she able to start newspapers? Was she of such high status or wealth that it made it feasible, or did she come from the lower rungs of society and fought her way up? Do you know, have any sense of how that works? And
well, she started out sort of lower rungs as far as starting newspapers. I think initially at one sheet newspaper. You know, I don't know the details of how she got access to a press and how she distributed it, but it wasn't, she didn't have employees. It wasn't a massive undertaking. It was her stepping forward and finding a way to print copies of this one sheet paper and distribute them. I know that there's a biography of her that I have not read, but that would be the place to look for that. She was not someone who was rolling in money and could just pay for all of these things. So she was someone who actually had to do what many women who were activists had to do, and that was find her way to people, and usually men, who could support or fund what she was doing in one way or another. But I don't know the details of that.
Excellent. Kevin, this is a great comment you put in the questions, but I'm going to I just want to let you know that I see it. We'll come back to it if we have time here. Jay Dobis, I don't know if that must just be like the username. What advice can we give to young women by looking at these amazing women you talked about and others? As a high school history teacher, I'm always trying to encourage each student to see their value and self-worth. These women can help. Can you talk a little bit more about that? I think it's a good, important conversation point today.
In a sense, this is going to sound really obvious, but if I'm typical of anyone, it might be something that others might not have quite realized the power of. So, you know, I see myself as a historian who is a woman, you know, and in however many recent years, I've been really very much in the public eye, partly because of the Hamilton musical that sort of put me forward in a more widespread way. What I found over and over and over and over again, anywhere where I went in public to give a lecture, was girls coming up to me and wanting to take a picture with me or wanting to be me, not having anything to do with me, but it was these young girls who I think had never seen a woman hold forth in front of a group of people that way, with, you know, with a sense of fun and seem like a person they could be, I think is part of it. So, you know, in Virginia, I gave a talk once, and a little girl came up to me with a picture she'd drawn of me and a little, holding a book and a little bubble coming out of my mouth, and the bubble said, "She wrote this." So I mentioned this not to talk about myself, but because I hadn't focused on or understood how powerful an example can be, right? How powerful a flesh and blood example can be. And for, you know, for girls, that can be a woman. For people of color, that could be someone for them that they can identify with who perhaps looks like them. In one way or another, I think girls need to understand that there are people like them with loud voices who are able to have loud voices, who say what they think, who, you know, push forward, put themselves in the public eye, and have every right to do that. But I think for up and coming people, up and coming girls particularly, the only way they can believe that is to see it. One last story, and then I'll go on to more questions. But when I was just beginning in grad school, this is how bonkers it is that I hadn't thought about this before. But when I first started grad school, I had a wonderful graduate advisor, Peter Onif, and he was supportive and wonderful. But at my first semester in grad school, I was invited to give a lecture at the Smithsonian. And I realized in thinking about what I was going to say, I had never heard a woman get up in front of an assembly, a woman historian, and hold forth. I didn't know what I was supposed to sound like. And I wasn't going to sound like Peter because he's this wonderful, boisterous guy. But okay, so what was I going to sound like? I didn't have a voice in my head. So I actually went, I was in Charlottesville, and I went to Williamsburg, and there, Joyce Appleby and Pauline Mayer, I think, were doing something in front of an audience. And I went just to see how women owned a room, right? What did they do with a room largely full of men? How did that work? You know, I actually had to hear it to believe it. And I just think there's a lot of power in that.
It's amazing. Thank you so much.
I also want to go on. I want to say one thing, and that is Tim Johnson talking about all of these women, the young Black woman who recorded George Floyd's murder, all of these other women, Black and white. That's not why I chose to talk about what I'm talking about this week, but that's been really evident. And that was certainly what I was thinking of while I was preparing comments. So I appreciate Tim laying that out there in our chat. Okay, now I'll shut up.
Katie asks, any other suggestions for other female advocates in the Revolutionary and/or Civil War era that we might not know about?
Oh, wow.
Any not well-known characters, quote unquote.
Well, I tell you, one book that I would suggest, and I even saw someone mention it already on the chat, that's about not necessarily the Revolutionary period, but early America, the Jefferson Presidency. That's Catherine Allgore's Parlor Politics. It's about elite women. So it's, you know, not women on the street, but it very much talks about some of what I was talking about before. And it goes, you know, chapter by chapter, woman by woman, you know, as far as, you know, presidency by presidency. And that's certainly one way to see some of what I was talking about, which is how these women parlayed power in a way that they felt able to do, but that actually really did give them power. As far as people during the revolution, I mean, you know, she doesn't, I don't know if there's something that's been explicitly written about her in this way. Abigail Adams, you should find the correspondence between Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren. When I was rummaging around in Founders Online for this, I started to get segued, you know, ooh, I love that correspondence. Really, really interesting because they're both very opinionated, politically opinionated women, and their conversation by letter is a really different way of looking at what's going on at the time. The other thing I would recommend, actually, and I saw one of her letters today, Catherine Macaulay Graham is a British historian, and Mercy Otis Warren was corresponding with her. So there was a woman historian in Britain, there was a woman historian in America. They were also talking about what they saw and what they thought. Another person who I was going to talk about this morning, and I just figured 3 was going to already take me beyond a half hour, is Phyllis Wheatley, who is a Black woman, started out enslaved, was a poet, a recognized poet, and had I want to say political commentary. Her poetry had, wasn't like Mercy Otis Warren, but she was reflecting her experience in some ways. She's a powerful figure, and particularly she was young. She was writing because people encouraged her to have an education while she was enslaved. And she really became known. You know, she has a brief, I know she wrote to George Washington, wrote a poem about George Washington. Anyway, that's a person who's really well worth tracking down too.
And I just want to mention, Kevin reminds us that it's a little bit later on, but Nellie Bly is another person that sometimes it's overlooked in history, and she is a phenomenal woman to study historically.
The 19th century, in a way, you know, as women's rights become more open, assertive, as women's education begins to really develop, it's easier at least to find these women. They're not necessarily having an easy time of it. Actually, one other thing that occurred to me while I was preparing my comments, kind of unrelated, but kind of not. And this, I'm not advertising my podcast, but this happens to be on my podcast. A year or two ago, I did an interview with Tammy Duckworth, Senator Duckworth. And it was for a show about women in politics and the rise of women in politics. But what struck me about that conversation, and I'd encourage you, I think recently on Backstory, there was an episode of like my favorite episodes from my time on Backstory, and this was one of them. She talked about imposter syndrome and how being in a room with all these guys, she, you know, all of her accomplishments and the power that she has, and she still went into that situation and saw these men and felt, you know, as I have too, imposter syndrome about the ways in which men overtalk her, and how Nancy Pelosi will sometimes weigh in and say, well, that's precisely what Senator Duckworth just said. What was interesting to me about that conversation was so much of what she was talking about, those are things that I've certainly experienced as well. It was really interesting to have that kind of a conversation at this moment with us in the capacities that we're in. And I just didn't expect, on the one hand, I didn't expect that kind of bonding about issues of being a woman in a male power space. So I felt kind of bonded with her over that, and then I felt angry because here we were bonding about that, right? Even she was undergoing that same thing. So it's a little off topic, but given that we're talking about women modeling behaviors, it's a revealing and kind of vulnerable interview that I'd encourage you to find.
Earlier you brought up Mercy Otis Warren and Abigail Adams' relationship, and that ties in with what Ben asked, which is how close were they, and how did they influence each other's thinking? Do you have any sense of that?
Oh, well, I don't know specifically how they did. They were friends. They were good friends. It's been a long time since I looked at their letters to each other, but they were really grappling with politics. I mean, you know, the John and Abigail and James and Mercy were close, were friendly. And I think, you know, I quoted a letter in which James is writing to John, but Mercy's inserting herself in. The correspondence I read between Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren was, I want to say, from the 1780s. So it might have been Constitution related, maybe some Revolution related, obviously given Warren's issues about the direction that things were going. This is probably not as chatty with the Adamses as we move into the 1790s. But so I would look to the revolution in the 1770s and 1780s. As I said, I think I would start by going to the Founders Online through the National Archives site to see how much of it is there. If you can't find it there, I can look and find it in other places. I read it on good old microfilm, so I can't tell you where I saw it sitting at a microfilm reader at UVA. But at any rate, it's worth looking at because they're both such smart people with these husbands that are politically engaged And so they have attitudes about not just politics, but also, what their husbands are doing. Really interesting. Abigail's correspondence too, the ways in which she takes advantage of the fact that she's a woman to get people's opinions and then report them back to her husband. I found an amazing letter. I guess I'll have to shut up soon because we're running out of time. I found her amazing letter in the Adams family papers from the late 1790s. So her husband is president. And it's very clear that what she did is she sat next to Thomas Jefferson at a dinner party and asked him very probing questions. And he was very clever in his responses because and the reason we know that is she wrote the conversation down like a script afterwards. Mm-hmm. Mr. A, Mr. J, Mrs. A, Mr. J. And then she handed that to her husband, right? Brilliant. And it's great because you can see, she wants to know Jefferson's opinion of various congressmen. He's like, I haven't seen him for a while. He's being cagey. But she in and of herself is a really, people at the time called her a better politician than her husband. So she's also worth tracking down.
What was the relationship between Warren and Thomas Jefferson? Do you have any sense that that's a question from Inger?
Yeah, no, she thought he was the answer to what Adams was not. She when he was elected president, I think she wrote a letter to him that was like, ha, now we're moving in the right direction. So she very much was more, would have been more Jeffersonian Republican rather than, Adams Hamilton Federalist-esque. So she liked him, she admired him, and she was more in line with his politics.
Well, we are nearly out of time, so let me ask one last question, and then we'll call it a day, at least for the recorded portion. Laura and Andy both ask, do you have a favorite? And so I'm going to combine them, and because I think they're both interesting conversation points. Do you have a current favorite women in the press or female historian?
Wow. Well, I would say there is a woman historian who I feel particularly, who I admire maybe more than many, and that's partly because I had a personal relationship with her, but Pauline Maier, the late Pauline Maier, was great revolutionary Constitution era historian, wrote a number of amazing books. And what I loved about Pauline was she was a brilliant scholar. She did wonderful scholarship, and she was always herself in front of audiences and on TV even. She was a very widespread presence in documentaries on TV. And when you watch her there, what you see her doing is speaking in a very accessible way, making jokes and laughing at them. I once heard her give a talk at Yale, and she talked about being the first historian to have access to the widespread organized collection of papers about the ratification debates. Mm-hmm. And she talked about reading a letter in which someone was writing about sitting at their desk and hearing the bells ring that indicated that their state had just ratified the Constitution. And she talked about how it brought tears to her eyes because it was so moving and it was so present on the paper. And I don't think I had ever seen a historian stand up and speak that way. I certainly hadn't ever seen a woman speak that way. And so in a sense, she's a kind of, ended up, without my thinking about it, being a kind of model for me, because she showed me that you can be yourself, and you can have humor, and you can be personal, and you can have emotion, and you can still be a smart historian who does good scholarship. So mm-hmm. The fact that I got to know her personally and that she became supportive was like the extra bonus. But I admire her for a whole bunch of reasons.
That's terrific. Yeah, it's amazing how we can see differences in the way that we can do things is phenomenal.
Well, it goes back to representation, right? I saw someone that there that I see it. Carol Birkin is a wonderful, I'm going to start now naming female historians. Get somebody. I'll shut up. But yeah, but Pauline ended up being someone who I had a lot of personal connection with. But yeah, representation matters.
I mean, and
mentorship.
This nobody really. I'm guessing people don't necessarily care about my opinion, but one of the authors that I had a similar experience with is Maxine Greene, who I never had a chance to meet. But when I read her work, and those of you who are in the education world, I highly encourage you to seek out Maxine Greene's work. But the way that she was writing was just so different then, but still scholarly. And it really just captures your imagination in different ways. And I'm grateful for you that you got to know Pauline and get that experience. So this is
I see someone mentioned it here in chat. Read Pauline's American Scripture on the writing of the Declaration of Independence. She's written a lot of good books. That's a recent one that I think does a lot of things really well. Has a chapter titled The Other Declarations, in which she shows and discusses the fact that individual towns were meeting to discuss independence and creating their own declarations, which is not something to think about, and alters the way that you think about the independence debate. So I will shut up because we're now like way past time. I'm overexcited, but I'm going to stick around for the after party, for those who want to stick around for the after party, which I enjoy as much as the conversation. I don't yet know what I'm going to talk about next week, but I will decide. On Twitter. For those who don't follow me on Twitter, it's at JB as in boy F 1755, which is one of the possible dates that Alexander Hamilton was born. I usually on there announce things that are coming that I'm doing, lectures and whatever, and I certainly will go on there, as an NCHE as well will announce what's coming up and post it on the NCHE .net/conversations page. So I will stop there. Thank you guys, as always, for coming.
Thank you, Joanne. This is a highlight of my week. I really do appreciate it.
Likewise.